Given a chained alien slave as a reward, he untied her shackles and called her his wife. The summons came just as the frost storm broke, timed too perfectly to be a coincidence. David Tren stood by the warped glass panel of his shelter, watching the last shards of ice melt against the polymer. He hadn't stepped outside in 2 days, not because of the cold he'd endured worse, but because quiet gave him time to think, and thinking lately had become dangerous. Then the alert pinged, a sharp sterile tone. Audit findings confirmed. Immediate attendance required. Overseer Van Sector Core. No details, no signature, but he felt it, the tension threading through every clipped word. This wasn't a debrief, it was a message, and Davin, despite everything, still understood threats when they came dressed as invitations. He pulled on his coat, fingers stiff from disuse, and stepped into the cold. The colony was carved into the bones of a hostile world, a terraforming attempt that had stalled decades ago. Officially, the planet was designated Reisa 7. Unofficially, the colonists called it Gray Line for the endless slate-colored horizon that never changed no matter the sun's position. Temperatures rarely rose above freezing. Even during the so-called thaw seasons, the wind carried fine crystal dust that chewed through gear, skin, and patience. The lift at the perimeter checkpoint groaned as it descended, a single blinking panel illuminating the shaft in pale green. David adjusted his collar, jaw set. His boots scraped the rusted floor plating. The sound was hollow, like the inside of a forgotten tomb. There had been another girl once, bright-eyed, defiant. She'd filed a complaint. They reassigned her the next day. David had checked every report. After that, her name never appeared again. He'd learned to stop asking. The elevator opened into the administrative level, if you could call it that, a corridor lined with dented metal walls and flickering lights leading to what passed for authority in this place. The guards outside Van's office didn't speak. One coughed into a glove fist, the other stared at him like a man watching ice melt. Too slow to matter inside. Overseer Van was already smiling. Mr. Trends, he said, arms spread as if greeting a guest. I've read your latest audit. Very thorough, very enlightening. David said nothing. He stepped forward and waited. You've uncovered a real knot in our supply chain. Miso-Uded shipments, falsified work orders, costs adding up in the wrong hands. A mess, really, one that could have embarrassed this colony, but lucky us. Van steepled his fingers. You fixed it. I reported the truth, David replied quietly. Van leaned back, the synthetic leather of his chair groaning beneath him. And for that you deserve a reward. The door behind Davin opened. 2 guards entered, leading someone between them. She looked like she'd been carved from a different story. Alien, yes, but not unfamiliar. Her skin was a deep quiet green, the color of moss after rain. Long black hair hung in unkempt ropes down her back, tangled and uneven where it had been hacked short and allowed to regrow. She wore a thin shift that clung to her shoulders like frost. Her wrists were locked in binding cuffs, heavy rust pitted, designed more for display than security. Her eyes stayed low, but she wasn't broken. Still, stillness was a shield. She's yours, Van said, gesturing with casual cruelty. Clean, obedient, not yet tagged, so you're free to register her however you prefer. Companionship is important for morale, especially out on the edge. David didn't speak. He couldn't. Something twisted in his gut, something old and familiar. She felt their eyes more than the cold. Each glance was a scalpel carving her down to what they wanted her to be. But behind her stillness she counted steps, breaths, exits. She noted how the tall one, the one who hadn't spoken, kept his distance. How his eyes didn't roam. That mattered more than his words ever would. No, it escaped Davin before he could stop it. Van raised an eyebrow. Excuse me, I don't need this. Return her to intake and flag your audit for review. Van's voice didn't rise. He didn't have to. We'd hate to discover an error in your calculations. Trends, a fabricated discrepancy, falsified charges. That sort of thing tends to spread. David felt the chill behind the words. The message was clear. Accept the gift or accept the consequences. He looked at the woman again. She hadn't flinched, hadn't spoken. Her eyes were still on the floor, but he saw now that they were open, watching. He forced his voice steady. I'll take her. Excellent choice, Van said, dismissed. The walk back to his shelter took 15 minutes through dust-laced air and slush-veiled ground. The path curved between fungal fields and abandoned dig lines where machines sat like rusting beasts frozen in the act of decay. She followed him in silence, bare feet leaving prints that disappeared within seconds. He didn't offer his coat. She wouldn't have taken it. That he was sure of. His shelter sat at the edge of the colony, a cramped prefab built before he arrived, repaired with his own hands. Re-insulated 3 times inside. It smelled of old metal and dried broth. 2 rooms, 1 heater, 1 narrow bed, enough space for a quiet man with no need for comfort. He let her enter first, then closed the door behind them. There were no words. He moved to the back wall, pulled open a crate and retrieved a small tool kit. Approached her slowly. She Tensed, her eyes flicked up. Just for a second he saw the depth their fear, yes. But something else. Appraisal. He knelt, placed the tools beside her and began unlocking her cuffs. The first click made her twitch, the second made her brace on. The third he paused. I'm not going to hurt you. She didn't respond, but her shoulders relaxed barely enough when the final shackle fell. David stood and stepped back. There's food, he said, gesturing to the stove. It's warm. Water's clean, you can sleep there. He nodded toward the cot, then he picked up his bedroll and stepped outside. It was dark now. The storm had passed, but the cold lingered, seeping into every seam. He lay down under the tarp stretched between his shelter and the generator shed, wrapped the roll around himself and closed his eyes. He didn't sleep. Inside she stayed standing for a long time. The cuffs were gone, but the weight of them still lingered. Her arms bore faint scars, pale against green skin patterned like old rivers dried by time. She walked to the stove, touched the pot. The heat startled her, sharp and sudden. She lifted the ladle with 2 fingers and poured broth into a metal cup. It smelled strange, rich, salty. She sat down and drank fast, too fast. Coughed, eyes stung. She held the cup tighter and drank again. Later, when the shelter grew colder and the heater ticked, she saw his shape through the frosted panel, curled under a tarp. Still, she took the blanket from the cot, wrapped it around her shoulders, then opened the door just enough to slip through. The cold hit like a slap, but she moved quickly, laid the blanket over him. Without a word he didn't move, but as she stepped back his hand shifted, closing gently around the edge of the fabric. She watched him for a moment longer, then turned and walked back into the silence of the shelter. It was not safety, not yet, but it was not what she'd expected, and that for now was enough. Davin woke before the sky lightened, as he always did, but this morning something was different. The blanket she'd laid over him hadn't slipped. It was tucked deliberately. The tarp above him glistened with frost, but the cold hadn't reached his chest where the fabric held. She'd come outside in the dark while he slept. He didn't move right away, just stared at the pale gray fabric inches from his face, trying to untangle what it meant. Not obedience, not gratitude. It was an action, a choice, one he hadn't asked for. When the cold crept into his bones he stirred, shook off the stiffness, and stood, his limbs act from the frozen ground inside the shelter. The heater had long since faded to its low cycle, barely enough to keep the air above freezing, but it was still warmer than the night air. He pushed the door open, stepped into the silence, and met her eyes. She was awake, seated cross-legged on the floor near the stove, her back to the warm wall. She didn't startle, didn't shrink, just looked at him with that same watchful calm she'd held since the moment he first saw her. The blanket was folded neatly at her side. The air between them held no words, but it didn't need to not. Yet he moved to the stove, cranked the starter until it hissed to life, then set a pot of water to boil. She didn't follow his movements, but she was alert. He felt it more than saw it, how her breath paused as he bent near the flame, how her shoulders tensed at the sound of boiling. Not fear, anticipation. When he turned with 2 metal cups, she accepted one without hesitation, sipped the broth slowly, no trembling this time, just silence. I'm going to the fields, he said quietly. I'll be back before midday. He didn't wait for a response, slid on his coat, laced his boots, and stepped back into the wind. The walk to the fungal domes was short but steep. Icy patches made the incline treacherous, and the path cut through jagged outcroppings of rusted pipe and abandoned machinery. The domes rose like tumors from the earth, their surfaces veined with mineral streaks. Spray nozzles pulsed every few seconds, misting the air with recycled nutrient sludge. The smell was metallic and faintly sweet. He checked the valve lines, cleared sediment from 2 intake vents, and realigned a miscalibrated pressure gauge. Normally he'd let his thoughts drift, count pulses, monitor pH levels. Today his mind stayed anchored to the shelter. She hadn't run, she hadn't curled back into the farthest corner or stared blankly through him. She had eaten, folded the blanket, even looked him in the eye. He didn't know her name. That was still a missing piece, and he refused to guess, but she was present. There was power in that. By the time he returned, the sky had faded to a dull silver. The shelter was still inside. The stove's glow painted her skin in faint orange tones. She was sitting near the cot this time, legs tucked neatly beneath her. Her hair was damp, what he realized, with cleaned water. The basin near the door was empty, the cloth draped to dry. She had bathed, not because he told her to, because she chose to. He placed his tools by the door, unwound his scarf, and crouched by the stove, pulled strips of dried fungus rat meat from the storage bin and laid them over the heat plate. They sizzled quickly, curling at the edges. You're welcome to use the cot, he said without turning around. I'll stay by the door. Still no answer, but she didn't move away either. He plated 2 equal portions and handed one to her. She took it, ate slowly, this time deliberately. The silence between them had shifted. It wasn't heavy anymore, just quiet. I'll go To salvage tomorrow, he said after they ate. You need boots, warmer clothes, maybe a knife if they don't ask questions. She looked at him, then at her hands. The scars across her wrist caught the firelight, thin white lines crisscrossing. Green skin, not fresh but not old enough to fade. He wondered if she'd ever had her own knife before, if she'd ever been trusted with one. After cleaning the plates, he poured another pot of water and set it beside her with a clean cloth. She took it wordlessly and turned her back. He stepped outside again, not out of necessity but respect. The wind had died. Only a low, constant hiss of vapor from the distant domes filled the silence. David sat on the edge of the crate, hands in his lap. He didn't know how long he stayed there, staring at nothing, letting the chill bite through his coat. It wasn't guilt he felt, not entirely. It was heavier, older, the sense that every good thing he touched either broke or vanished. There had been a girl once, bright and defiant. She filed a report. After a supervisor crossed a line, David supported her. 3 days later she disappeared from records, reassigned off planet without warning. No forwarding contact, no trail. He never found out what happened to her. Maybe he hadn't tried hard enough. Maybe that's why he'd stepped forward in Van's office when he shouldn't have. Not out of courage, just shame that finally grown claws. When he re-entered the shelter, she was seated by the stove again, clean now, wrapped in the same thermal blanket she'd given him the night before. Her gaze followed him as he laid out his bed roll across the doorway, not as a barrier, just placement, a gesture. He didn't speak. Neither did she, but as he lay back and closed his eyes, her voice came barely audible, dry, rough, from disuse. One word. Why? He opened his eyes, met hers. I don't know yet, he said honestly, but I didn't want them to have you. She studied him for a long moment, then slowly she leaned her head against the wall behind her and let her eyes close. That night sleep came in pieces, short broken spans of half-conscious rest, but they were enough, and for the first time in years Dave and Tren didn't dream of screaming silence or empty corridors. He dreamed of warmth. Not fire, not flesh, just presence. And when morning came, she was still there. The mornings came quietly on gray line. There was no sun to break through the sky, just a slow lifting of darkness into a haze the color of rusted steel. The shelter's interior shifted from deep shadow to dim gray, the only warmth radiating from the stove's low flame. David woke to the scent of heat, moss boiling in the corner pot, mild, earthy, a bit sour. For a moment he didn't move. Something felt different. He turned his head and saw her. She was crouched by the stove, stirring the pot with careful, practiced movements. Her long black hair, still slightly damp, framed her face in uneven strands. She wore the same thermal blanket draped over her shoulders, but it no longer looked like armor. It looked like clothing, like choice. Her eyes flicked to his, brief, assessing, then back to the stew. No words passed between them, but something had shifted in the silence. He sat up slowly, stretching stiff muscles beneath his shirt. The air inside was warmer than it had been for days, not just from the stove, from the sense that for the first time since she arrived they were sharing the space. Smells better than when I cook it, he said softly, voice still rough from sleep. She didn't answer, but her stirring slowed and the corner of her mouth twitched. Not a smile, not yet, but close. They ate in silence, seated a few feet apart, knees almost touching. She didn't flinch when he handed her the bowl, didn't drop her gaze. Afterward he cleaned the dishes while she sat watching the vapor rise through the vent pipe. Her posture was relaxed, not completely, but enough that her shoulders no longer touched her ears. You spoke last night, he said gently. Not turning around. You asked why. She didn't reply, but when he set the bowl aside and sat across from her, she met his eyes. No fear, just caution, familiar, controlled. I still don't have a better answer, he admitted. I saw what they were doing and I didn't want to be part of it. A pause, then softly, you were. Her voice was low, deeper than he expected, rough but not broken. He swallowed. Yeah, I was. She watched him carefully, as though weighing his reaction. Why didn't you leave me there? She asked, no anger, just a question, like testing the edges of something sharp. I thought about it, he said honestly, but I couldn't walk away. That doesn't make you good. No, he said it doesn't. That answer seemed to settle something between them. She leaned back slightly as if a decision had been made. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers twined together, no longer curled into fists. My name is Luria. The sound of it hit harder than he expected. A name offered freely. He nodded. I'm David. I know, she said. They said it when they gave me to you. Something twisted in his chest. I didn't want that. He said, you being a reward. I know, she replied, voice steady. Outside wind scraped across the metal panels, rattling the bolts on the Sautaussaying wall. Inside the warmth remained intact. He stood, moved to the crate near the door and pulled out a wrapped bundle. I found these this morning, he said, unrolling it on the floor. A thick wool tunic, salvaged pants with thermal lining, and a pair of insulated boots, worn but intact. She looked at them, then at him. You went to salvage? He nodded. Traded some tools. I don't use any more. She reached for the boots, first turned them in her hands. They were too big, but her expression didn't change. Thank you, she said. David looked away, giving her space as she dressed. When he turned back, she was lacing the boots, the sleeves of the tunic rolled back at the wrists. He'd imagined she'd look fragile in clothing that didn't fit, like someone playing dress-up in another life, but instead she looked grounded, like she belonged in the world again, not hovering at the edge of it. Later that day they walked together to the fungal field. She didn't speak much, but she watched everything: the sprayers misting the dome, the rusted tools, the shifting sky. Her eyes were sharp, taking it all in. There's a rhythm to it, David explained, adjusting a valve. Each dome gets fed twice a day. If you skip even one cycle, the roots start dying. She crouched beside him, inspecting the growths. Your people eat this? He nodded. There's protein in the flesh, not much taste, but it keeps us alive. She reached out, pressed a fingertip into the side of a bulb. The skin gave slightly, then rebounded. It's not native, she murmured. It smells wrong. He raised an eyebrow. You can tell. My people used to grow food in caves, similar methods, different smell. It was the first thing she'd shared about herself. He didn't push, just let it settle. When they returned to the shelter that evening, she went straight to the stove and began boiling water without waiting for instruction. David sat at the crate table, hands folded, watching her work. She moved differently now, not like a prisoner waiting for command, but like a person reclaiming a piece of routine. As they ate, she looked up at him and said, they took my name when I was captured, called me Thing Asset Unit. It's been a long time since someone said my name and meant it. David's throat tightened. You're not a unit here, he said. She nodded, not as a reply but as a marker of understanding. That night when he laid out his bedroll, she shifted the cot slightly to one side, making space between them. No wall, no symbolic line, just proximity, just enough. And when they both lay down in silence, neither of them felt like strangers anymore. They weren't healed, they weren't safe, but they were real, and for now that was enough. They walked through the colony together now, not beside each other, like partners, but not apart either. A careful distance, the kind that left room for retreat, hers if she needed it, his if she demanded it. Lyria wore the boots David had traded for her stride, quieter now on the hard frosted walkways. Her steps had gained rhythm, but her eyes still searched, scanning corners, watching guards, noting cameras. It wasn't paranoia, it was habit, survival. They carried a container between them filled with prepped protein spores for the processing depot. Just another errand, just another day, but David could feel it. Every gaze they passed, every sideways glance from men who remembered her shackles and couldn't quite accept her standing on her own feet now. They didn't spit yet, but the silence was heavy. Halfway to the depot, someone broke that silence. A low voice from behind. Didn't think you liked your prizes walking upright trends. David stopped cold. The words didn't surprise him, but the timing cut deep. Lyria turned her head just enough to see a stocky man leaned against the recycler tower, arms crossed, face split, with a crooked grin. Not a guard, just a miner, but the kind who liked power wherever he could steal it. David turned. Say that again. The man laughed. Easy, no offense meant, just surprised. You're showing her off like that. Lyria stood still. She didn't cower, didn't move behind Davin, but he saw her hand curl into a fist at her side. She's not a thing, David said, not a prize, not yours to comment on. Something in his voice must have changed because the miner looked up, expression cooling. He didn't reply, just pushed off the wall and walked away. They finished the delivery in silence. Later, back at the shelter, Lyria stood by the door, her arms folded. She hadn't said a word since the exchange, not during the walk, not during the unpacking. David filled the kettle and set it on the stove. I'm sorry, he said, for what he said. I've heard worse, she replied. He turned to face her. That's not the point. She looked at him. Then what is? He exhaled, sat on the crate beside the stove, arms resting on his knees. The point is, he said slowly, you shouldn't have to hear any of it. Her gaze softened, but only slightly. You can't protect me from what people think, she said, and I don't want you to. He tilted his head. What do you want? That stopped her for a moment. Her face flickered, hesitation, maybe fear, but it passed. I want you to understand that I've survived worse things than insults, and that surviving doesn't mean forgetting. She walked to the far wall, crouched beside the basin, dipped her hands in cold water and let silence stretch. Then, without turning, my people were taken during the Lorian expansion. Our systems were deemed low threat, low tech. We had no ships, no fleet. We didn't resist, not at first. We thought if we gave them what they wanted, they'd leave us alone. Her hands moved slowly through the water, washing away dirt that wasn't there. I was 16. They loaded my village into transports. I don't remember the name of the first station, just that it smelled like burned oil and piss. They assigned numbers, burned them into Clothing the first time someone touched me without asking I bit his hand they beat me broke 2 ribs that's when I learned how to be quiet David didn't interrupt he didn't move they sold us like livestock and eventually I stopped hoping someone would see me she stood dried her hands turned to face him and then one day someone did her voice didn't shake that unnerved him more than anything I should have helped sooner he said back at the admin center I knew what they were doing I saw the rotation schedules I filed audits and looked the other way she stepped closer but you didn't look away from me he opened his mouth then closed it again I had a sister he said before the collapse she was part of a protest group on Mars. Pacifists thought she could shame the board into cutting ties with off-grid slave markets they took her during a rally she vanished no records no recovery I filed complaints pushed back. Got blacklisted they reassigned me here she studied him the silence between them stretching into something more than silence it was understanding recognition. Did you love her? She asked. She was the only person I didn't lie to, he said and there it was his truth Lyria stepped to the cot pulled the blanket around her shoulders and sat down slowly. I don't want saving, she said but I won't stop you if you want to stand with me. His reply came without hesitation I'm already standing that night they didn't sleep far apart not touching not yet but close enough that when the wind moaned across the fields and shook the walls they both stayed warm the first time she laughed it was because of a fungus rat David had spent half the morning elbow deep in slush trying to pry a snapped coolant valve from the base of a mist regulator when he spotted it small fast and ugly as sin it had slipped past the perimeter fences and somehow wedged itself under the spray pipe twitching its tail like it owned the place he threw a wrench missed the creature darted left then right then bolted straight into his boot he jerked back tripped over a rock and landed on his side in a shallow puddle of half-rosin runoff when he came limping back into the shelter soaked through one sleeve and muttering under his breath. Lyria looked up from where she was mending a pair of gloves her eyes met his drop to his mud-covered arm then back again and she laughed short breathy unguarded like a sound she hadn't meant to make he froze she caught herself too late biting down on the smile but her eyes were still lit still alive in a way he'd never seen before he blinked then grinned glad I could be useful you looked like you were wrestling it she said the corners of her mouth still twitching I was she handed him a dry cloth you lost they didn't speak much for the next hour but something had shifted again this time without words the air between them was lighter not easy but easier David changed clothes dried his boots by the stove and sat across from her while she sewed her hands were deaf her focus steady you've done that before he said watching the thread pull tight my mother taught me she replied she used to mend everything even when we didn't need it what was she like Lyria paused needle hovering mid-stitch she smelled like salt and clay sang off key and hated silence David smiled gently she'd hate it here then she would have tried to plant something anyway said soil listens to patience he didn't know what to say to that so he didn't say anything at all the next day the cold snapped hard the kind of cold that bit into metal and clung to skin like teeth David ignored the sting he always did there were too many pipes to fix too many cables exposed by frost heat by mid-afternoon his fingers had gone numb beneath his gloves and the ice was setting into his shoulders but he didn't stop not until the ground shifted beneath him not until the tools dropped from his hands and the edges of his vision grayed he staggered back to the shelter on autopilot not remembering the walk Lyria opened the door just as he reached it pulled him inside before he could collapse she didn't speak just moved with frightening efficiency dragging him to the cot stripping off his soaked clothes wrapping him in every blanket they had his skin was white blue breath shallow she lit the stove to full heat boiled water pulled down the emergency thermal pack from the supply shelf and wrapped it around his chest he groaned once tried to sit up don't move she ordered her voice was low but firm hands pressed flat to his skin measuring for warmth he managed no she said more sharply this time you're not fine the fever set in by nightfall she kept the water boiling bathed his forehead with cloth spooned broth between his lips even when he didn't respond his eyes opened once cloudy unfocused and he said her name like it belonged to someone else La don't go I'm here she whispered he didn't hear her by the second night he stopped shivering she wasn't sure if that was good or bad his breathing was shallow pulse erratic she sat by the cot one hand resting lightly over his eye don't know how to do this she said quietly I know how to kill how to endure but I don't know how to wait the shelter was quiet except for the soft hiss of the stove and the whisper of wind against the outer panels she stayed awake by the third day the fever broke when he stirred coughing weakly she was beside him with water he drank barely but his eyes focused for the first time in hours you're back she said her voice barely above a breath I left he Rasped she smiled just a little. You weren't exactly good company, sorry don't. Be he lay back exhausted. You stayed of course. His hands shifted, found hers. She didn't flinch, didn't pull away. I thought I was done, he murmured. You almost were. Silence settled between them, but this time it was full. Thank you, he whispered. You don't have to thank me, she said. You gave me a bed, a name. You didn't ask for anything. That's more than anyone's given me in years. He turned his head toward her. I didn't give you anything, I just stopped taking. She didn't correct him. That night she slept beside the cot on the floor, her hands still wrapped around his. He didn't dream of cold that night. He dreamed of her voice, quiet and steady, calling him back to life. David woke to the sound of steady rhythmic scraping metal against stone. He blinked, disoriented for half a second before he saw her crouched near the stove, sharpening a salvaged knife along the edge of a broken alloy panel. Her movements were clean and unhurried, every pull of the blade purposeful. The fever was gone, his mind was clear, but the weight in his chest hadn't left. Morning, he croaked. Lyria looked over her shoulder. You're alive, she said flatly, but her voice held a softness it never used to. You slept through 2 meals and a visit from the overseer that woke him properly. Van came here, not Van. One of his men asked to confirm your audit logs. I told him you were unconscious. David sat up, head pounding. What did he say? He laughed, said, you must be enjoying your prize too much to show up for duty. Davin's jaw clenched. And you? She held his gaze. I said, he's not enjoying anything, he's sick and I'm not a prize. Silence, then she added. Quieter. He didn't laugh after that. David slowly pushed the blanket aside and stood, legs weak but steady. Lyria rose, too, watching him carefully as he moved toward the water basin. He washed his face in silence. That was risky, he said. Not unkindly. So is breathing, she replied. The tension dissolved with that single line. He smiled despite himself. Later that afternoon, when Davin could stand without swaying, they walked together into the heart of the colony. It wasn't often they ventured that far in. The closer you got to the command dome, the thicker the surveillance got. The more uniformed men you saw, the more teeth behind the smiles. But they needed gear, new heating coils, sealant tape for the water line, and another thermal blanket. David hadn't thought to ask for permission, and Lyria hadn't asked to stay behind. The trading hall was busy, crowded with workers fresh off the mid-cycle shift. The recycled air buzzed with noise and filtered light. No one stopped to greet them, but heads turned, conversations quieted. The presence of the alien woman walking beside David like an equal disrupted the social balance. Like a stone dropped in still water, Lyria didn't shrink. She walked beside him, chin level, eyes forward. Her steps were measured, not cautious but grounded, like someone who had reclaimed the right to take up space at the requisitions counter. The clerk barely looked at the list David handed over. Instead, he let his eyes travel to Lyria and linger there, still bringing her around. Huh, he said, surprised you haven't traded up. Heard there's a new batch in from the outer moons. David didn't move, but his voice dropped to a low, dangerous calm. Say that again. The man grinned. I'm just saying you look like the type who likes a little variety. Lyria stepped forward. You speak too freely, she said. The men blinked. Excuse me. She moved closer. Slowly, deliberately. You think I won't remember you, that people like me don't keep track, but we do. His smugness faltered. I didn't mean you meant exactly what you said, she replied. You see me and